is Andrea Kane, and I'm here with you for HIT 421, Legal Aspects, which also includes release of information. We have now moved on to week 7, and this week we'll be covering chapters 10 and 11. And so this lecture video will be on chapter 10, and I'll come back and do another one on chapter 11 for you. This week we will be focusing on unit objectives 9.6.1 through 9.6.17. And I think you can see those on your syllabus. You could also take a look. I think they're also in our content for the week. All right, so let's talk about HIPAA, because chapter 10 is all about the privacy rule, and then so is chapter 11, because there's a lot there for that. If you want to follow along in your book, I am on page 205. All right, so HIPAA. Please note, HIPAA has one P and two A's, not two P's and one A. It is one P and two A's. Having come through this program, you're going to be expected to consistently spell HIPAA correctly, so make sure you make note of that. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996 obviously came into being then. Its focus was on healthcare fraud and abuse prevention, medical liability reform, and then the bulk of it was on administrative simplification, where it went into talking about privacy standards, security standards, transactions and code sets, initiating national provider identifiers, and how some things would be enforced. HIPAA follows a number of laws, and they are listed for you. And what HIPAA was originally designed to do had to do with health insurance portability, meaning that if you changed jobs and you moved or what have you, that your health insurance would follow you. But as the as the law was written, it really morphed into something else, which many federal laws do. They start out focusing on one thing and end up transitioning into a couple of other areas. But the really cool part about HIPAA is that they realized that in exploring all of this about health information, that many states did not have good, solid, specific laws governing health information. And as a result, the federal law became the standard, the minimum standard. Basically, if your state had pretty pathetic laws when it came to health information, you would now have to step it up to the federal law, to HIPAA standards. If your state had really good health information laws already in it, then you could stay there, because HIPAA was the minimum. It was actually below some state laws. And so if you were already meeting your state laws, you were great. There were only maybe one or two tweaks you might have to do with HIPAA. But for the many states who did not have good laws, good state laws, they found themselves having to step up their game and move up to meet the minimum requirements of HIPAA. Who does HIPAA apply to? It is all about requiring the covered entities and their workforce, and then later business associates were added to this, their workforce and their subcontractors. Those are the ones who have to abide by HIPAA and prove it. And what do they need to do? They have to understand what is defined as protected health information, and then they have to understand what's included, what's excluded, and how that's going to be handled. And all of this is in your book. I would really encourage you that as you go through your book, that you would highlight information that if you're not familiar with the terms that are in blue, royal blue, that you make sure that you are. You can also check your glossary in the back of the book for additional information. But you need to know that HIPAA applies to covered entities, business associates, and anyone who is part of their workforce or their subcontractors. HIPAA applies to protected health information, so anything that's de-identified is not covered. Anything that the privacy rule defines as being not covered is not covered. But if the privacy rule defines it as being an identifier, then it is covered. And it excludes personnel and educational records because really it's focused on protected health information. Covered entities, when you define it out, are healthcare providers that conduct certain transactions electronically. Most often you think of hospitals, pharmacies, physicians, physician office practices, long-term care facilities, clinics, those types of things. Transaction examples would be healthcare claims and encounter information, health plan enrollment, health plan premium payments, coordination of benefits, health claim status. And when you talk about health plans, you're talking about insurance plans and healthcare clearinghouses, which do intermediary billing for covered entities. So pretty much it's anybody who's a healthcare provider, anyone who's a health plan, and anyone who acts as a healthcare clearinghouse. Those are all the ones that are covered entities. And then business associates are a person or organization that's not a covered entity that performs functions on behalf of the covered entity that involves the use or disclosure of that PHI. They are required to have a business associates agreement, and they are required to abide by all of the HIPAA rules that a covered entity does. If a business associate uses a subcontractor, they are also required to follow the same rules as their business associate, even if they're just a subcontractor. And again, business associates are required to follow the same rules as covered entities. And where this change, originally when HIPAA started, business associates did not have to meet the same level of requirement that covered entities did, but the High Tech Act that came as part of the ARRA, that made that a requirement. So these days, it's been so long since HIPAA and ARRA/High Tech that just know that in today's world, covered entities have to hit all the requirements, business associates have to hit all the requirements, and even people who are subcontractors of business associates have to meet all those requirements and comply with HIPAA. Workforce members are defined as employees, volunteers, student interns, trainees, and anyone else who works under the covered entity's direct control. Contractors that work on a covered entity's premises may be considered workforce members if they routinely work there and if they're handling PHI or have any kind of relationship with PHI, obviously. PHI, there's a three-part test to determine what is PHI, and we'll see that coming up. De-identified information. This is exactly what it sounds like. It's information where the identity of the individual has been stripped away. If you have information that has been de-identified or that information identifying the individual has been stripped away, it is not subject to HIPAA privacy rules. And there are 18 elements that have to be removed in order for information to be considered de-identified. And let's see what page that is on. It is on page 214. So if you flip to page 214 in your textbook and you look at figure 10.4, it will list for you all of the data elements that have to be removed for de-identification. You can set it up to re-identify using an unrelated code to link de-identified information back to the individual. For example, if you're involved in medical research, a lot of times they will de-identify information and they use that for research and they're able to share that information. But then they have it may be paper, but most often it's electronic, where they can go back and they can see if they have to trace individual information, they can trace it back to the individual. So they sort of have a key or a code that enables them to link it back. But they have to be able to provide the de-identified information. Okay, so going back here, it says there's a 3-part test. Oh, this is still identifiers. So these are all the items that would have to be removed in order for de-identification to take place. Let's see, does it say? Oh, there's the 3-part test. Okay, really quick. Individually identifiable information of persons who have been deceased greater than 50 years is not protected by the HIPAA privacy rule. Okay, please make sure you know this one. That if someone has been deceased for greater than 50 years, their information is not protected by HIPAA privacy rule. And I'm going to make a statement here. You don't need to know it for your test, but for real world, almost no one keeps records that are for 50 years old. There are a few places that do, and a few states that do, but for the most part, patient records are destroyed so quickly in our world that you would almost never get to the point where someone's been deceased for 50 years and you can still access their information. Just saying. But please know, again, that once someone has been deceased after 50 years, their information is no longer protected by HIPAA. What is the 3-part test for determining whether information is PHI or not? Is it individually identifiable in any form or medium? Does it identify the person or provide a reasonable basis to believe the person could be identified from the information given? Okay, so that's part 1. Is it related to someone's health condition, physical or mental, past, present, or future, or provision of health care or payment for provision of health care? And then the third part is it held or transmitted by a CE, covered entity, or its BA, business associate? So those are the 3-part tests, and you need to know this. Can you identify the person? Is the information related to anything health related or healthcare payment related, that sort of thing? And is it held or transmitted by a covered entity or its business associate? Those are the 3 parts that are used for determining whether or not information is PHI. There are some other key terms that you need to make sure that you are aware of, including individuals, personal representatives, designated record set, disclosure, use, and request. And then this last one is really critical. You'll hear it all the time. TPO, treatment, payment, and healthcare operations. I'm going to refer you back to your textbook. Please make sure that you look all of those up and make sure that you understand those. And again, if you're not sure with what the book is saying, go to the glossary in the back and see if they give you a slightly different wording that helps you with those. All right, there are some organization types they want you to be aware of. And again, your book does a great job of covering these, so I'm going to refer you back to your book. You need to know what a hybrid entity is versus an affiliated covered entity versus an organized healthcare arrangement versus a covered entity with multiple functions. So let's talk about privacy rule documents, because there are specific documents that HIPAA mandates. The first one is a notice of privacy practices. This has to explain to the patient how their PHI will be disclosed, what their individual rights are. It has to be made available upon the first encounter. It also has to be posted in a prominent place. It has to include the HIPAA and HITECH outline content requirements, And you have to have proof that the individual received the information and acknowledged it. That's why they make you sign off on it. You have there. So the first one was notice of privacy practices. The next one is consent. You have to sign a consent to use or disclose PHI for treatment, payment, healthcare operations. It is an optional document and revocation must be permitted. Now, having said that, though, the HIPAA rule says that you don't need patient authorization for treatment, payment, and healthcare operations. But they do want you to try and get the patient to consent to that. But at the end of the day, it is optional because under the law, treatment, payment, healthcare operations, that doesn't it doesn't require consent. Authorization. This is a written permission for a specific disclosure. It has to contain the HIPAA required elements, and it's required unless the disclosure meets the HIPAA authorization exception, like treatment, payment, healthcare operations, or state law mandated releases, such as for infectious disease or something like that. When uses and disclosures are required, even without authorization, you still should be accounting for those disclosures in case they're requested or in case you have an HHS investigation. There are some times when uses and disclosures are permitted without authorization. There are 18 situations. They do include a couple of situations where the individual does have the opportunity to agree or object. It does include quite a few where the individual does not have the opportunity to agree or object. And these uses and disclosures are permissive only. HIPAA permits but does not require. However, you cannot violate a stricter or more protective state law. Meaning, if your state law says that you have to report this information and HIPAA says that you don't necessarily have to report it, you have to go with your state law because that is the more stricter of the two. So let's see. Does it give us those requirements? Yes, on page 225, there's figure 10.8. This gives you situations where authorization, it lists the authorization requirements for use and disclosure of PHI. But it also says when the patient can agree or object, and then some situations where the patient cannot agree or object because it's by law. And so it lists all of those. So I would recommend that you make yourself very familiar with figure 10.8. And again, whenever there is a conflict between HIPAA, which is federal law, and state law, you go with whichever one is the most strict. So if in your state the law is more strict than HIPAA, then you go with your state law. If you are in a state like Iowa, where HIPAA is usually more strict than Iowa statutes, then you're going to go with HIPAA. You always go with whichever one is the most strict. This just goes through some of those specifics, and again, you can read through those in your book. And again, treatment, payment, healthcare operations, those are situations where the person cannot object because that's written into the law. And this just lists the ones that are permitted without authorization. All right, redisclosure. This involves PHI that was created by and received from another entity. It used to be, years and years and years ago, when I first started in the field, that if you received, let's say, a radiology report from a different hospital and you added that into your medical record, you could not redisclose that. You would have to direct the person that's requesting it to the original facility that generated or created the information. You could not redisclose it. It's probably been, at least 15 years, maybe closer to 20, I would say now, close to 20 years, where you can redisclose it. If you make it a part of your medical record, then you can redisclose it. So let's pretend that we're in a little community hospital and we receive pathology reports from the University of Iowa in Iowa City. And if we put those pathology reports into our hospital or physician office medical record, they become part of our record. Now we can redisclose that information. 20 years ago, you couldn't. But the point here is that under HIPAA, you can redisclose that information. So, for instance, if the patient says, I want a copy of my entire record, you have to even print off or copy off or provide an electronic copy of everything, including those pathology reports that came from Iowa City. Because once you put it in your medical record, it becomes part of that and it can be redisclosed. There are commercial uses and disclosures of PHI that are governed by HIPAA, specifically marketing, communication about a product or service marketing is communication about a product or service that encourages its purchase or use. The general rule is that use or disclosure of PHI for marketing requires patient authorization. The only time you can get around that patient authorization is if your marketing activities occur face-to-face with the individual, or they concern promotional gifts of nominal value, meaning like a pencil, very, very inexpensive. They do define some activities that are not marketing, and you can read through those. If there is any remuneration to the covered entity, that has to be disclosed, and there have to be opt-out instructions provided. And where you often see this marketing is in maternal child care. For instance, a woman comes in to give birth, and maybe the formula companies have put together a bag, and it's got materials and information and some formula samples and a few other things, and they want to give it to the patient. The patient can choose to opt out. They can choose to say, no, I don't want you giving my information to the marketing company. Again, HIPAA was the first rule. And then you have ARRA that came about 10 years later. And HITECH is a subsection of ARRA. And HITECH clarified a lot of things, clarified and expanded a lot of things in HIPAA. One of the things it did was also talk about marketing and limits covered entities' ability to categorize communications as operations rather than marketing. So that was one of those things that came out of HITECH. And this just goes into fundraising, which is still under commercial uses and disclosures of PHI. Sale of PHI was absolutely not permitted. You can't sell patient PHI without the patient's authorization unless it has to do with public health or research data, or if it's part of, say, a covered entity sale or merger. Then there's the minimum necessary requirement, and this is a really critical one for you to know. So make sure that you understand what is minimum necessary. If you're looking at your textbook, this starts at the bottom of page 232. And minimum necessary covers a lot of ground. It essentially says that, first of all, people who handle PHI should only have access to the information they need to do their job. And second of all, they should only disclose the amount of information needed to fulfill the request. So instead of erring on the side of, oh, I'll send a copy of everything, and that way they won't ask me again for other information, it's now no, you only send the absolute minimum amount that you have to in order to complete the request. And then the same thing about jobs. If you don't have a job-related need to know the information, you shouldn't have access to it. And that is it for Chapter 10, which is Part 1. I will be back shortly, and we will talk about Chapter 11, which is Part 2. Take care.